My daughter had power of attorney papers drawn up before I even left the emergency room. She just forgot one thing. I never signed them. My name is Dorothy. I'm 68 years old, and I spent 31 years teaching 4th grade in Burlington, Vermont. I know how to spot a child who thinks they can get away with something. I've been doing it my whole career. What I didn't know, what I could never have prepared myself for, was that the child I'd have to watch most carefully would be my own. I want to tell you this story because I think some of you already know pieces of it. Maybe not the exact details. Maybe not Vermont in January, or a kitchen that smells like cinnamon and old books, or a daughter named Renee who used to fall asleep on my lap during thunderstorms. But the feeling underneath it, that slow, creeping sense that something in your own home has shifted without anyone asking your permission. I think you know that feeling. I think some of you have been living inside it for a long time and haven't found the words yet. I found mine, and I'd like to share them with you. Let me start at the beginning. Not the dramatic beginning, not the part with the hospital or the lawyer's office or the morning I sat across from my own daughter in a courtroom and watched her realize she had underestimated me completely. I want to start even earlier than that, because the real story never begins where we think it does. It begins in the small moments, the ones we brush off because we love someone and we'd rather make excuses than face what's right in front of us. My husband, Walter, passed 6 years ago, prostate cancer. We had 41 years together, and I won't pretend those years were perfect, because they weren't, but they were ours. And when he was gone, the house felt like a library where someone had come in the night and removed every single book. Just the shelves remaining, the shape of what used to be. Renee was the one who suggested she and her husband, Craig, move in. Not permanently, she said. Just until I got back on my feet. Just to help with the bills, with the yard, with the loneliness she said she could see on me like a coat I'd forgotten to take off. I was grateful. I was her mother, and I was lonely, and I said yes, and that was the beginning. For the first year, it was fine. More than fine, honestly. It was good to have noise in the house again. Good to have someone drinking coffee at the kitchen table in the morning. Craig fixed the back gutter that Walter had been meaning to get to for 2 years. Renee and I started watching British mystery shows on Thursday nights. I thought I had made the right choice. But somewhere in the second year, things started to shift in ways I couldn't quite name. My things started disappearing. Not stolen, just relocated. The reading chair I'd kept by the living room window moved to the spare bedroom because Craig said it blocked the television. The calendar my sister had given me, the one with photographs of covered bridges in the Northeast, replaced by a digital screen Renee bought that showed the weather and Craig's fantasy football standings. My name wasn't on the internet password. I had to ask Craig every time I wanted to get online on my own computer, in my own house, and every time I asked, he gave me this look. Just a flicker. The look a person gives when they're being interrupted from something important. Still, I told myself it was nothing. They were busy. They were tired. They worked long hours, and I was retired, and perhaps I was being too sensitive, too attached to small things. I'd taught 30 years of 9-year-olds. I knew the value of picking your battles. I should have picked more of them. I know that now. The thing about losing yourself slowly is that no single moment feels like the moment it happens. You just look up one day and realize your pictures are on one small wall in the hallway, not the living room, not the mantle. And your granddaughter's school artwork is on the refrigerator, but your grocery list isn't. And you've somehow started eating dinner at 5 o'clock because that's when Craig gets home, not at 6:30, the way you ate for 40 years. None of it is dramatic. None of it would sound like much if you described it to someone. But each small thing is a thread, and eventually you realize they've been weaving something around you the whole time, and the weaving is almost done. The fall happened in November. I was coming down the back stairs, the ones that lead from the laundry room to the kitchen, and my sock caught the edge of the step, and I went down hard. I broke my wrist and cracked 2 ribs. The ambulance came, and I remember being on the stretcher in my own kitchen thinking, this is the most helpless I have ever felt in my life. I am 67 years old, and I am being carried out of my house on a stretcher, and I don't even know where Renee is. She was at the hospital before I arrived. I'll give her that. She was there, holding my hand. And she cried, which surprised me, because Renee has always been more like her father, careful with tears, careful with everything. I told myself that crying meant she still loved me the way I remembered. I told myself a lot of things in those first hours. The surgery on my wrist took 3 hours. I was in the hospital for 4 days. And it was on the 3rd day, when the pain medication had been reduced and I could think clearly again, that a woman I had never met came into my room and introduced herself as a patient advocate from the hospital administration. She was kind. She had a soft voice, and she chose her words the way you choose your footing on ice. She told me that my daughter had been in contact with the hospital regarding my discharge plan, that Renee had expressed concerns about my ability to live independently, that Renee had spoken to someone in their care coordination department about options for transitional care, which is the careful hospital way of saying assisted living. I looked at this woman and I said, "Did my daughter ask me about any of this?" She paused. And that pause told me everything. I didn't sleep that night. I lay in that hospital bed with my wrist in a splint and my ribs wrapped, and I went back over the past year, the way you go back over directions when you realize you've taken a wrong turn. I thought about the chair, about the calendar, about the password, about the way Craig had started referring to the house as our place in conversations with neighbors, about the way Renee had gently, over many months, started suggesting I might be more comfortable somewhere smaller, somewhere with people my own age, somewhere with medical staff nearby, just in case. I thought about the fact that I owned that house outright. Walter and I had paid it off 11 years ago. I thought about my savings, which were significant, not extravagant, but the result of a lifetime of living carefully. I thought about the fact that I had never updated my will after Walter died, and that Renee was still the sole beneficiary. And then I thought about something a colleague of mine used to say. She taught 5th grade, retired the same year I did. She used to say, "When a child is misbehaving and thinks you haven't noticed, the worst thing you can do is let them know you've noticed before you know the full extent of what they're doing." So I didn't say anything. Not yet. Renee came to discharge me on the 4th day. She was warm, she was attentive, she had a bag with my favorite cardigan, and she'd remembered to bring my reading glasses. We drove home mostly in silence, and I watched the Vermont winter going by, outside the window, the bare maples, the gray sky, the old farmhouses set back from the road with smoke coming from their chimneys, and I thought, I have lived here for 40 years. I raised my daughter here. I buried my husband here. This is my home, and I am not going anywhere. The papers were on the kitchen table, not hidden, right there on the table, next to a cup of tea Renee had made me, which told me she'd planned this moment carefully. She said she'd had them prepared by a lawyer, a family friend of Craig's, she said. She said it was just a precaution. Just something practical, she said, given the fall. Given my age. Just power of attorney, which would allow her to manage financial and medical decisions on my behalf if I ever became unable to. I sat down. I picked up the tea. I looked at the papers. I didn't pick them up. I asked Renee when she'd started planning this. She said she'd been thinking about it for a while, that the fall had made it more urgent. I asked her if she'd planned to discuss it with me before having the papers drawn up. She said she knew I'd resist, and she just wanted everything to be ready. I want you to hear that. She knew I would resist, and her solution to that was to not ask me. Her solution was to have everything ready, the papers, the lawyer, the moment, so that I might simply sign before I had time to think clearly. My daughter is not a cruel person. I want to be honest about that, because I don't think this story is simple enough for a villain. Renee grew up watching her father manage everything, the money, the house repairs, the insurance, the taxes. She grew up believing that aging meant becoming managed. She had absorbed that belief the way children absorb everything without realizing it, without questioning it. And then she had married a man who reinforced it, who saw my house and my savings not as mine, but as a future inheritance to be protected, and in the protecting, gradually assumed control of. None of that makes what she did right, but I understand it, and understanding it was part of what allowed me to respond the way I did. I told Renee I was tired. I told her the drive home had exhausted me and I needed to rest. I told her I'd look at the papers later. She accepted this, which told me she was confident. Confident people wait. Confident people don't push. I went upstairs and I called my friend Margaret. Margaret and I have been friends for 30 years. She is 71 and sharp as a tack, and her late husband was an attorney, and more importantly, She has the kind of mind that cuts directly to the center of a problem without ceremony. I told her everything. She listened without interrupting, which is rarer than people think. And when I finished, she said, "Dorothy, you need to call Paul Whitmore tomorrow morning. Before you sign a single thing, before you say another word to Renee about any of it." Paul Whitmore was a local attorney. He had been our neighbor for 12 years before he moved into town. Walter had trusted him completely. I called Paul the next morning from my car, which was the only place in the house I was sure I wouldn't be overheard. He listened. He asked questions, careful, specific questions about the dates of certain conversations, about who had paid for the legal fees on the power of attorney, about whether my name was still on all the accounts and deeds and utilities at the house. When we were done, he said, "Don't sign anything. Come to my office Thursday." I told Renee I had a follow-up appointment with my orthopedist. She offered to drive me. I said I preferred to go alone. What Paul told me in his office on Thursday changed the shape of everything. Renee had not only had power of attorney papers drawn up, she and Craig had also been in contact with a real estate attorney about the process of transferring a property deed in cases of, and I want to make sure I get this word right, incapacitation. They had not taken any steps to actually transfer anything, but they had made inquiries. They had been informed. They were prepared. Paul looked at me across his desk and said, "Dorothy, your instincts are correct. This is organized. This is not your daughter panicking after a scary fall. Someone has been planning this." I sat very still for a moment. I thought about the thunderstorms, about Renee falling asleep on my lap with her small hand curled against my arm, about the smell of her hair when she was a child. Then I said, "Tell me what we need to do." The first thing was my will. I updated it immediately, not in anger, not as punishment, but because an updated will is the clearest legal statement of my intentions. I established a trust. I designated Paul as executor. I specified in detail what was to happen to the house and to my savings. And none of it involved Craig, and very little of it involved Renee in the way she had been anticipating. The second thing was harder. I went home, and I told Renee I wasn't going to sign the papers. She was calm at first. She gave me the reasons she'd given before my age, the fall, practical concerns, just being careful. I listened to all of it, and when she was finished, I said, "I understand that you're worried about me. I also understand that you had an attorney look into transferring this property without telling me. So I'd like you to be honest with me right now, because I would rather have an honest, hard conversation than a comfortable, dishonest one." The silence that followed that sentence was the longest silence I have ever sat inside. Renee cried. Not the controlled tears from the hospital. These were different, and somewhere in the middle of them, she said something I didn't expect her to say. She said she was terrified of losing me, that she'd watched her father decline, and she'd felt helpless, and she never wanted to feel that way again, and so she and Craig had decided together to take control before there was a crisis, before it was too late. I believed her. I believe fear makes people do things they wouldn't recognize in themselves on a different day. I also believed that Craig had pushed this further than fear alone would have taken Renee. And I believed that intention, however frightened, does not excuse action. I told her that the papers would not be signed. I told her that I had updated my will. I told her that I needed her and Craig to move out of my house by the end of February. She left the room. Craig came in 20 minutes later, and he was not kind. He used words I will not repeat here, and he made clear that he believed I was making a terrible mistake, that I was being irrational, that I would regret it when something happened to me and there was no one there. He said it the way people say things when they want you to know they've already accepted an outcome you haven't accepted yet. I told him the conversation was over, and I asked him to leave the room. They moved out on February 19th. It took 3 weeks, and it was the most uncomfortable 3 weeks of my adult life, and I will not pretend otherwise. There were days I sat at that kitchen table after they left for work, and I thought about picking up the phone and saying, "Never mind, come back. Let's forget it." Because grief is not only for the dead. You can grieve a version of your child. You can grieve what you believed your relationship was, and the grieving is real, and it costs you something. But I didn't make that call. What I did instead, after they were gone, was something I had been thinking about since that conversation with the patient advocate in the hospital room. I converted the back half of my property. There's a carriage house back there. Walter always meant to renovate it, never got around to it. I had it fully renovated. It took 8 months, and most of what I'd been saving since Walter died. And in October of the following year, I opened what I now call the Bridge House. It's a transitional residence. It provides free short-term housing to women over 55 who are displaced coming out of difficult living situations, navigating a divorce late in life, dealing with exactly the kind of slow erosion of autonomy that I had experienced. Women who need somewhere safe to land while they get their footing back. We've housed 11 women in the past 14 months. 11 women who came to me with that same look, the one I recognize now, the one I was wearing myself without knowing it. That quiet exhaustion of someone who has been made to feel that their own life is not quite theirs anymore. I am not a saint. I want to be clear about that. I did not do this to be noble. I did it because when I was lying in that hospital bed in November, the worst part wasn't the broken wrist or the cracked ribs or even the papers on the kitchen table. The worst part was feeling like I didn't have anywhere to go. Like the only door open to me was the one someone else had decided I should walk through. I wanted to build a door, a real one that opens from the inside. Renee and we're talking again, carefully, the way you talk across a distance that's been established by something true rather than something small. She is in counseling. I believe she is working to understand the difference between love and control, and I believe that difference is one of the hardest things any of us ever learns. I have not forgiven Craig. That is honest. Maybe someday. Not yet. My wrist healed well. I take the back stairs slowly now. One hand on the rail, the way Paul's wife used to do, and the way my mother did before her, and the way women in this family have apparently always descended staircases with a little extra care and a great deal of intention. I still teach, in a way. I volunteer at the elementary school 2 mornings a week, 4th grade. Same age I always loved best. 9-year-olds are at that perfect intersection of old enough to reason with and young enough to still believe that things can be different from how they found them. I find that hopeful. I find it necessary. If there is something I want you to take from my story, not a lesson exactly, I was a teacher long enough to distrust tidy lessons, but something I want to leave with you, it is this. The moment someone begins making decisions about your life without consulting you is not a small moment. It does not matter how that moment is wrapped. It does not matter if it's wrapped in worry or in love, or in practicality, or in the language of just being careful. The moment someone assumes authority over your choices without your consent, that is the moment to pay attention. Not the moment to fight, necessarily. Not the moment to panic, but the moment to become very, very clear about who you are and what belongs to you. I spent 67 years building a life. A good one. Imperfect, as all real things are, but mine, and I can tell you now. Sitting in this kitchen with the afternoon light coming through the window, the way it always has, and the sound of the 2 women in the carriage house moving around and making tea and beginning to find their footing again. I can tell you that nothing anyone tried to take from me was worth as much as the moment I decided not to let them. I know some of you watching this are living inside that slow erosion right now. Some of you recognized what I was describing before I even got to the hard parts. If that's you, I want you to hear me say it plainly. You are not too old to act. You are not too difficult for insisting on your own life. You are not a burden for expecting to be consulted about your own future. These are your years, every last one of them. Thank you for spending a few of your minutes with me today. It means more than I can properly say.